Happy coding.
Hey there, Kevin here, and welcome to the next video in our series of Intro to Web Dev. So in the last video, we talked about for loops and how they can help you like repeat code, and that's really useful if you have like a bunch of the same looking code that you want to do over and over again. And this video sort of builds on that to introduce like what I think of as like the partner of for loops, which is a new type called arrays. Um, so to get into that, I'm just going to sort of dive into the code. So I'm going to give you sort of like the motivation for it first. What I have here is the project in Glitch, and right now it just has an index.html page that has like a simple h1 here, and then an empty UL, and that UL has an ID of output, and then over in my JavaScript, I get a reference to that output element, and then I add a single li to it. So that's just sort of the starter code that I'm going to use to sort of get into it. Okay, so hopefully all of that is review, and I'm not doing anything too fancy here. I'm just outputting some content from my JavaScript to the HTML. And so let's say that I wanted to build on this, and I don't know. Let's say I wanted to make like I don't know a zoo or something. I don't know why that's my example, but let's say I wanted to say like here are the animals I saw at the zoo. That's probably too long. Yeah, it's way too long. Um, I'll just say zoo. Sure, whatever. All right. So I just changed my h1, and now in my script.js, I want to output like a few animals to my code. So I might do that by creating some variables. So I might say like, I don't know, like let animal one equals lions. Let animal 2 equals tigers, and let animal 3 equals bears. Sure. Um, and then I could use those variables in my JavaScript just like I can, any variable. So I'm going to change my code here a little bit. I'm going to output animal1 plus the li. So I should just see 1. So animal1 is lions, and I see lions out in my HTML here. And I can kind of repeat that line of code. So I'm going to steal this line of code and just kind of copy paste. And I'm going to change this to animal2 and animal3. And this works, right? This is, you've probably seen code like this before. You've probably written code like this before, where you have, multiple variables that you're dealing with, and you are sort of dealing with them one at a time, where you're outputting them to the page. And this works, but it's pretty tedious. So if I wanted to add another animal, I could do it. I could say let animal 4 equals, I don't know, lizards. Um, but then I'd have to go down here and I'd have to remember what I named my variable. And even with just 4 animals, this is getting pretty tedious. You're probably skipping ahead because you're like, yeah, dude, I know how to write this kind of code. And it's also kind of error prone because you have to like remember what you named your variable, and if you change it in one place you have to change it in multiple places, and it's just kind of tedious and kind of annoying to deal with. So what if there was a way to not do that, right? That'd be great. And shockingly enough, there is, and it's called an array. So an array is a new type. So you have seen already like strings, and you've seen numbers, and you've seen booleans. These are all types. It's like the kind of value that a variable will hold, or the kind of data that a value contains. And an array is a new type that contains multiple values. And that might sound a little trippy, but let's just kind of show you an example. So I'm going to get rid of a lot of this code, actually. And instead of all of this, instead of having animal1, animal2, animal3, I'm going to create one variable, and I'm going to call it animals. And I'm going to set it equal to an array. And there's a few ways that you can create an array in JavaScript, but the way that like you'll see a lot, and the way that I'm going to use is using square brackets. So these are square. It's not a parenthesis and it's not a curly brace. This is, I think, new to what we've been doing, and it's like a square bracket. So it's actually the same button as a curly brace. You just don't type shift. And inside of here, I'm going to put a comma separated list of values. In this case, I'm going to use string values. So I'm going to say lions. I'm going to spell it right. And then a comma, and then tigers, another comma, and I'll stick with bears. I'll add lizards in a second, maybe. And then at the end, I'm going to have a semicolon. Okay, so I've created a variable, and this variable points to an array, and the array contains 3 values: lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. I don't know if I've made that joke already, but I'm going to probably make it again. And now that I have this, I can use it. I can use this array just like I can use any other value. But the difference is that I don't want to reference all of the animals. I want to reference one animal at a time. So I'm going to go do that here. So where I have animal 1, 2, 3, I'm going to say animals. So I'm getting a reference to that variable that I just created. I'm just like, that's the variable I created. And then I'm going to use the square bracket notation again. And then inside of this, I'm going to give it an index. So in JavaScript, arrays, their indexes start at 0. So this is kind of an important thing. So lions is the first element in the array, and it has an index of 0. So animals 0. And I'll do the same thing for the rest of it. So animals 1, and then animals 2. And this looks a little goofy, probably, if you haven't seen it before. 0 indexing is a little trippy, but it's a computer sciencey thing, and it just means that you have to remember that like counting starts at 0 in a lot of computer science languages, and JavaScript is one of them. So you'll see 0-based indexing a lot. And here you go. You see my animals are output to the page, and I don't need to create a bunch of variables for each separate animal. I just store them all in my animals array. So now adding a lizard is a little easier. So I can say lizards here, and then I can steal a line of code, and here I'm going to say animals with an index of 3, and there's my lizards. Okay, so that is sort of using an array. So I'm creating an array here, and then I'm referencing each individual element of the array by an index. And this is, an improvement over what we had before, where I had like 4 variables at the top that I'm using all of them at the bottom. But it's still kind of annoying, because when I add something to this array, I still have to add something down here. And this is, a relatively small example. This gets a lot more annoying as your code gets more complicated. So what we can do is remember the last video that we watched, and remember that for loops let you repeat code with like minor adjustments based on like an index. So I'm going to modify this code to use a for loop instead of having this whole big mess. So to write a for loop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the for keyword. So for, and then an open parenthesis. Glitch is nice enough to give me the closing parenthesis. And then in here, I'm going to create a variable. So I'm going to say let index. You can also say let I. That's a pretty common thing, but I sort of like the longer variable names. So let index equals 0. And remember when we talked about for loops, I said, a lot of for loops will start at 0, and maybe that doesn't make sense yet. This is why, because arrays are 0 indexed. So a for loop starts at 0 often, because you're going to use them with arrays. So let index equal 0, and then I'm going to loop until index is less than. And what do I want here? So I could say the size of the array is 1, 2, 3, 4. So I could put a 4 here, but there's actually a shortcut to it. So I can say animals.length. So this is a property of arrays where instead of me hard coding the number, I can ask my browser like, hey, how many elements are in that array? And then a semicolon, and then finally index plus plus. So this is telling my my for loop to start at 0, loop until you get to the size, which maybe I'll talk about in a second, and then after each iteration of the loop, increase index by 1. So then inside of my for loop, I want to steal one of these lines of code, and instead of outputting an element like at a specific index, like instead of a hard coded like 0, 1, 2, 3, I'm just going to use my index variable here. So now this code is saying, first off, create a array, call it animals, add lions, tigers, bears, and lizards. Those are values. Add those values to my array. Then get a reference to my output element. And now create a for loop that starts at 0 and ends when index reaches animals.length, which in this case is 1, 2, 3, 4, and increase by 1 each time. And every time the for loop iterates, or every time it runs, add this string to the inner HTML of the output element. And this string is an li with the animal at that index. So now, drum roll please, if I zoom out, I should see lions, tigers, bears, and lizards. Oh my. And so notice that I'm not like really worried about like how many elements are in my array when I get down to this line of code, this for loop. This just kind of magically works. So I can actually add a bunch of animals pretty easily. So I don't know, if we were in person, I would say, hey, give me some animals. But since you're not, I'll try to come up with some myself. So I don't know, spiders, anteaters, and oh my goodness, I can't type. Andalites, fish, and the magic here, like the big payoff is I'm changing one line of code, like a single line of code. In fact, it's less than I'm adding one little piece to a single line of code, and the rest of my code magically works. This for loop keeps working. I don't have to touch it ever again, because the for loop and the array are working together to say, hey, no matter what's in that array, we know what to do. So I can add, 100 things here if I really wanted to. I'm going to maybe hit this button. Does that wrap it? Yeah, okay. So here's another way you might see arrays. Again, JavaScript does not care about white space. So if you have a bunch of things in your array, you might add sort of new lines in between them, and that's totally fine. Okay, so that is using arrays and for loops together in harmony to like output a bunch of stuff to your page, or to do a bunch of repeated work based on whatever's in the array. So from here, I'm going to talk about a few ways to extend this, I guess, in ways that you might see or that might come in handy. So the first thing I'll mention is there are other ways to write a for loop. So this is, I think, what I would call like the classic way to write a for loop. You'll see this syntax pretty much everywhere. I would consider this like the default syntax for writing a for loop. But there are other ways. So let's say, I just want to output a bunch of animals. Notice that the only thing I'm using my index for is to index into the array. And for loops, where that's true, there's actually sort of a shortcut that you can take. So I am going to delete all of the stuff that's inside of my for loop, and I'm going to instead use a slightly different syntax, which is called like a for of loop. So I'm going to say for let animal of animals. And this gives me a variable, which is, animal, and it's every element in the array animals. I can call this whatever I want. I call this XYZ if I really wanted to. But for this example, animal makes sense. And then I can change this to just use animal because I no longer care about the index. I'm only using it to get into the array. So a newer feature of JavaScript is it skips that step and it says, just give me every animal in animals. You no longer have to check the length. You're not writing the index yourself. And this works, right? This still works. So I can add more. I can say, I don't know, deer, goats, snails. And this line of code will continue to work. I will say that this line of code makes sense if you don't care about the index, but you often do care about the index. So let's say that I wanted to, I don't know, like have numbers in here. Well, first off, like maybe I would just use like a different list element, but whatever. Let's say I wanted to use the index for some reason, which is pretty common. So that means I kind of have to go back to the old school style where I'm saying let index equals 0, index is less than animals dot length and index plus plus, and putting this back. I'm just putting back to what it was before. But this means that I can do something like plus index plus colon maybe. And this string is getting pretty messy, but I'm just appending a bunch. So I'm creating an li. I'm starting it with whatever the index is. I'm adding a colon afterwards. Then I'm adding the animal at that index, and then I'm closing my li, which results in something like this. So it depends on whether you want to use your index or not. And so if you want to use your index in other things other than just getting into the array, then you'll generally use a classic for loop. If you don't use your index for anything else, then you'll probably use like a for of loop. That's a pretty common thing. So that's one common thing that you'll see in tutorials. So I didn't want that to like catch you off guard. The other thing I want to talk about is there's actually, other ways to work with arrays. So right now I have this array and it's getting kind of ugly. So let's pretty it, and sure. Well, it didn't work at all. Let me put these on their own line. I'm sort of hard coding a big list of animals. And this works if you know your data ahead of time, but let's say that I wanted to, I don't know, like ask my user for input and I wanted them to give me a bunch of animals. And we saw that before with like getting user input and with like the Mad Libs and the quiz and stuff. So let's say I wanted to put those in an array for some reason. I can do that because arrays are modifiable. You can change them in JavaScript. And what I mean by that is I can use sort of like what I would call like array functions. And so if I have an array, instead of like adding them like, when I create it, I can add it later. I can add elements to my array later. So I can say animals, animals dot push, and this is a function that will add an element to my array. So in this case, I'm going to say, I'm running out of animals, gerbils. So this line of code adds gerbils to my array. And the rest of the code should work fine. So now I should see gerbils down here. And there are many array functions. So if you wanted to learn more about those, I've said before that my goal is not to teach you like every single function and variable in JavaScript. It's to teach you like how to teach yourself. So I don't know, JavaScript array functions. And sure, MDN, that's a great resource. So if I go here, I can probably scroll down or right over here on the left. Here's a bunch of functions that I can call. Some of them are more useful than others, I'll say. But let's say you wanted to reverse an array, like you got an array and you actually wanted it in the opposite order. I can do that. You can sort an array. So if you wanted your array to be alphabetized, you can do that. Splice lets you like remove an element. That's kind of the opposite of push. And there's a bunch here. So you can learn more about these, exactly how you learned more about like new HTML tags, new CSS properties. There's a whole world of resources out there, and I highly recommend checking them out. Okay, so that is array functions, and again, I recommend looking into those because there's a bunch of handy like utilities. So if you find yourself like, I have this array and I want to do something different with it, maybe there's a function for that. Keep that in mind. Okay, so then just a couple more things to talk through. So I can push stuff to my array. The other thing is that there are functions in JavaScript that give you arrays. So instead of like, hard coding a big list of animals, let's say I wanted to ask my computer, actually, maybe I'll pause and say, so you've seen the document.getElementById function, right? You've seen that goes into your HTML page and it says which single element has the ID of output, and it gives you that element, right? There are other similar functions that give you, for example, every element with a particular class name. So instead of an ID, it's a class, or every element with a particular tag. And because it's not a single element, it's actually multiple elements. And maybe I'll just give you an example of that in this code. So in index.html, I don't know, it's going to be a little contrived. So I'll say, maybe I'll add some p tags. So I'll say, I went to the zoo, and here are some animals I saw, and maybe one more like after my output just to make it a little spicy. I don't know. That was my day at the zoo. It's really hard to come up with examples while the camera's on. Just saying. All right. So all I've done is change my HTML, right? So I've got this p tag that says I went to the zoo. This p tag that says here's some animals I saw. My JavaScript is dealing with the UL with this ID, and then I have my face is in the way again. Can I scroll up? No, I can't. I'm going to move my little face. I have over there, I have the last little p tag. So let's say that I wanted to write JavaScript that did something with those p tags. I can do that. So if I go to my script.js, I actually never remember this line of code. So I'm going to go to a search engine. I'm going to type in like JavaScript get elements with tag, something like that. And yeah, okay, W3 Schools, that's a pretty good resource, and it's get elements by tag name. So I'm going to try that, get elements by tag name. So if I bring that into my code, and where do I want to do this? I'll just do it sort of after all of this rigmarole. Oh my God, my face is going to be in the way no matter where I go. Let's go, oh no, I'm moving everything. Let's go over here. I don't know why I don't just turn it off. Anyway, I've got my code over there, so I'm just going to add this little bit sort of after everything else, but it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to say let p elements equals the line of code I stole from the internet, get elements by tag name, and I'm going to say p. So this gives me an array. I haven't used any, square brackets or anything, but p elements contains an array, and that array itself contains every element on my page that is a p tag. So then I can write a for loop for it. So I'm going to, I have a choice. I could say like for let index equals blah, 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 but maybe I don't care about the index. So I'll use a for of. So I'll say for p element of p elements, plural, curly brace. And let's say I wanted to, I don't know, set its style. So p element dot style dot color equals, I don't know, red. Now if I zoom out and, I need a let here. So again, like making mistakes is a normal part of code. I can't say it enough. And I don't know, I'm tempted to always edit this out, but I'm not going to, because it's normal. It's totally normal. Even I, who have been coding for 20 years, I still make really silly mistakes. Uh, what just happened is I noticed that I had a little red dot here. So I'm like, oh no, something's wrong. So I quickly just kind of looked and I compared it to like my mental, like sort of what I've seen before. And for us, that means looking at the class notes and like reading through tutorials, looking at examples. And in this case, I just forgot the let. So it's a little silly, but that's fixed. And then here's another one. Okay. In this case, I need the document dot. So again, making mistakes is a normal part of coding. All right. So now I have my p elements variable, which now contains the array because I didn't make any mistakes, hopefully. It contains the array of every p element, and then I can write code that uses that array exactly like if I just created it in my own code. So if I zoom out, indeed, now my p tags are red, but I didn't add any CSS. I didn't do that in the HTML. I did it in my JavaScript. And that's sort of the power of all of this. It sort of works together to let you, write HTML, write JavaScript, and write CSS that all output the final result to the page. Okay, so that is getting an array from this function, and there are other functions as well. So you might have come across something called the query selector function, and I kind of stay away from that at the beginning because I want to focus on getting things by ID. But you can write any kind of selector that will select multiple elements, and you can get a bunch of them. So that's another thing to look for. But the idea is the same. You call a function, it gives you an array, and then you can work with that array. My face is in the way again. And you work with that array by writing a for loop. Okay, so there's two more things I want to chat through, and that is one more way to get an array is another really common one that might come in handy, and that is splitting a string. So let me think about how I want to do this. So yeah, let me delete a bunch of this code, actually. I want to delete this because my p tags don't really matter. Okay, and then let's say I want to delete all my animals. So instead of, well, now I've just got gerbils. I kind of want to keep that, but let me get rid of it. Now my animals array is empty, and my for loop. Let me move my dumb little face back over. I don't know why that bugs me, but it does. So I've got my empty animals array, and it doesn't contain anything. And when I get to this for loop, I say for let index equals 0. Is 0 less than the length of the array? Well, the length of the array is 0. Is 0 less than 0? No. So it actually skips this entirely. So I don't actually output anything to my page. So what if I wanted to get a list of animals from the user? How would I do that? And some of it, probably makes sense. I could go over to my index.html page, and let's say, I don't know, I'm just going to put an input here. And maybe another p tag that says p list some animals. Okay. So I've got an input, and I don't actually do anything with it. So let me maybe add an ID of, I don't know, animal-input. I will forget about that in a second. And I can type stuff here, cats, dogs, lizards. Nothing happens yet, so let me add a button maybe. And this is getting a little annoying, but button on click equals, maybe I'll load from on click. And I'll just say, okay. All right. So I've got an input and I've got a button, and I'm going to get rid of some of this. So I'm not going to do this when the page loads anymore because I want to wait for the user to click the button. So the only thing that's really changed is I've added an input and I've added a button. And when the button clicks, I'm going to call the load function. So, I don't actually do anything with the input yet. So if I click OK, nothing will happen. Okay, so now in my script.js, what I can do is first, let's say here, I'm going to give myself some white space. I'm going to first get a reference to that input. So I'm going to say let input element equals document dot get element by ID. And I promised I would forget it. I already did. I just called it animal dash input. And then the whole thing is going to be like the value of like what the user entered is going to be input element dot value. So what I want to do is take that value and split it up. So let's say I said, you know, dogs, cats, lizards, and there are spaces in between them. You know, there could be anything in between them, but for now I just put spaces. So what I want to do is split the string up based on spaces. And so if I don't know how to do that, which I don't remember, let's look it up. So JavaScript string split. I know the function is called split. I just don't remember exactly what it wants. Oh, here it goes. That's easy enough. So the split function is a function that you can use on strings that splits a string into an array based on a character that you give it. So let's look at what that looks like. So I'm going to say, instead of animals equals and then hard coding it, I'm going to say animals equals input element dot value, which is the value of the whole thing. This is the whole string that the user typed. So this is a string, which means I can say dot split on it. This is itself a function which takes a parameter of, you know, some character or some string to split on. In this case, I'm going to give it a single space. So this line of code is saying, get the input element, get the value from the input element, and split it up. Like wherever there's a space, give me whatever the words are in between those spaces. And I think the rest of the code will work because animals is now an array that I get from calling the split function. Okay, so we're a few levels deep, but this should mean that I can say list some animals: dogs, space, cats, space, lizards. And you know what? I kind of want my gerbils back in the mix. If I click OK, fingers crossed that I didn't make any mistakes. Boom. There we go. So the rest of my code works because it uses an array. And the for loop itself doesn't care whether I hard coded that array with the square brackets, whether I called like document.getElements by tag name, or whether I called the split function here on this string. So there's multiple ways to get an array in JavaScript. There's many ways. And so there's a ton of functions that you can call that that will return an array, that will give you an array that you can then do, you know, interesting things with. So you can get, you know, every element with a particular tag name. You can split a string into multiple words, or if you wanted to separate by commas or new lines, you can do that. So the possibilities are pretty open there. But the idea is that once you have the array, you can use a for loop to repeat a bunch of work for every element in that array, and you're saving yourself a ton of coding. Because I could type a million animals in here, and this 3 lines of code would still do all of the work. So that's the magic. That's the power of for loops and arrays working together. Okay, so the last thing I want to call out, which isn't always obvious, is sort of the ability to put whatever the heck you want inside of a for loop. So some folks, when they see an if statement and when they see a for loop, they think that they're kind of separate things. But really, code can be combined into, like, you know, infinite combinations, really. So you can have an if statement inside of a for loop. You can have a for loop inside of an if statement. You can have if statements inside of if statements. You can have for loops inside of for loops. It doesn't really matter. So just to show you an example of that, let's see. So let's say I wanted to only output animals that start with a certain letter, for example. So let me think of a good letter. Let's go with K. My name's Kevin, so let's go with K. So let's say that inside of my for loop, I wanted to write a piece of code that only ran if the element at that index started with a K. How would I do that? Well, first, what I might do is like look up how to figure out whether a string starts with a letter. So JavaScript string starts with letter. And sure enough, here's a page on W3 Schools that gives you an example. So that's not a great example, but it gives me something to work with. String dot starts with. Okay, let's use that. So I can say in my code, so I'm inside of my for loop right now. I am like, this is the code that runs every time the for loop runs. So I can say for every animal in my array, which I'm currently getting from the user, I can say if animals index dot starts with, and what did I want? I wanted K. Then I will output my output, my HTML. So I just did some formatting of my code, but basically this is what the end result will look like, where I have a for loop, and this for loop is looping over every element in the array. And for every element in the array, I am checking, does it start with K? If it does, then I add it to my page. And if it doesn't, I don't do anything. I could do something else. I could maybe say like else console.log bad animal plus animals index. Instead of outputting it to the page, I just put it in the console just so I know. And so if I open up my console, that's over there, and let me clear that out so we can see it. And so let's add some animals. So dogs, sure. Lizards, sure. And let's get a couple with a K. So kangaroos, gerbils. I need another one with a K. I don't know why I chose K. Katydid is an animal that starts with a K. Kinkajou is an animal that starts with a J. And bears. So I've got, a bunch of animals in there. Some of them start with K, some of them don't. Let's hit OK, and hopefully I didn't make any mistakes. And yeah, here we go. Here's some animals I saw: kangaroos, katydid, kinkajou. And then over here in my console, here are the animals that don't start with K: dogs, lizards, gerbils, and bears. I'm still using the index. That's kind of a leftover from what we were doing before, but I could remove that if I wanted to, but really it's just an example. So the real point I wanted to make here is that your code can combine multiple ideas into like a total, right? So you can have an if statement that runs inside of a for loop. You can also do it the other way. You can have a for loop that runs inside of an if statement. You can have if statements inside of if statements. So don't be surprised when your code starts to get more and more involved, because it will. All right, that's I think everything that I set out to talk about with arrays here. So you now know how to use for loops, which are cool, but really their power comes from using them with arrays, because again, I have this line of code, and before I added all this if statement stuff, it was really just one line of code that would output every single element of an array, even if there was a million of them, and my code would still work. And that's pretty cool. And that will save you a ton of time. If you're now thinking back to previous projects where you're like, wait a second, I could have just used an array instead of typing the same thing 100 times. Yeah, sorry, you probably could have, but now you can appreciate why arrays are so powerful. So I'm going to leave it there. The next thing we're going to talk about is another way to organize data called objects. But for now, thanks for watching, and as always, happy coding.